wanted to talk about procedural generation stuff because you brought up a whole bunch of things about. I'm already interrupted.
Okay, do it.
I wanted to talk about procedural generation because you were talking about how you think that they should try to procedurally generate different parts of the story than typically are thought about. Like people tend to go to the meat in procedural generation in terms of like they want to do level design, they want to do procedurally generated story elements, which doesn't work out very well typically. But you wanted to kind of shift the focus of procedural generation to, hey, why don't we try procedurally generating the way that the shots are laid out and framed in the cinematics? Like, why don't we change which characters are in focus, which characters are out of focus, which characters we follow and which ones we don't follow in a story that's otherwise fully articulated? And I was thinking, like, that's cool. And it led me to think about procedural generation in other contexts and other games and how I found it lacking or annoying and to be mostly just second-rate level generation to plow through. And I don't really have much to comment about the narrative-based stuff now, but as that was just kind of a framing for what I was thinking about. And you mentioned trying to do procedural generation at a higher level with more awareness of the environment in the story, like what the characters are doing and stuff like that, and to generate dramatic effect and things like that procedurally instead of having it be based on like a human director picking out shots and stuff. And I was thinking, what we can do the same thing in gameplay by having procedural generation that's more aware of the conditions of the game and what the player can and can't do at any given moment. So I'm just thinking about roguelikes, the typical and like mainstay of procedural generation, like your typical roguelike where you're going through floors of a dungeon and fighting monsters and collecting items. And I was thinking about how in roguelikes there aren't often situations where things are impossible. Usually it's more like you just don't have enough power to overcome an obstacle. It's not that the obstacle is impossible to overcome because you can't fly or because you can't swim or because you can't X or Y. It's usually like, oh, I can't do enough damage to kill this thing before it kills me, or I don't have enough resist against poison and survive long enough to kill it, or whatever it is. And I was thinking, well, if you make your procedural generation system less of like randomly selecting between a bunch of things that the designer thinks are level appropriate, and instead you had it say like, hey, the player can do this much damage, the player has this much health, like the player can fly and they can breathe underwater and they can do these things. Like, let's give them a challenge that's calibrated to push a bunch of those buttons, but also hint at other things that they could find and could do that would improve themselves to allow them to conquer other challenges. So it's like almost like a Zelda dungeon. Like, you show the player a puzzle before they even get to it, and you taunt them by putting elements in the game that lock stuff behind things that you can't get past at this point in the game. But then later, when you get the water arrows or whatever, you can put out the fire, and then that makes the area passable. So you can go through the hallway and get to the other part. So why can't you procedurally generate that? Why can't you say like, well, in this level there's like a waterfall of acid, and you can't get through it because you are biological and you'll just melt in acid. But that doesn't say to you, well, you just can't get through it because you didn't roll well enough. Sorry. Actually, what it should be is it should be an invitation for you to find a way to get through the acid. And the game should think about it and be like, well, I put this acid thing here, and the player can't get past it because he doesn't have acid yet. So I'm going to put acid in the next couple of floors so he can come back. I'm going to put acid resistance or acid immunity in the next couple of floors so the player can come back to this and explore this other content, which I've made intentionally harder because I know he'll have to come back to it later.
There's a ton of stuff going on there, right? You can have typically procedural generated happens with levels and maybe enemies, right? They'll roll a random enemy for you with some random properties. They'll create a random character generator or something to that effect, but it's just pretty much random, right? And when you have a system like a character creator, it's really not that complicated because, jacking stats up and down, attributing some points to one stat or another, it's just kind of low-level variation that you're messing with. Now, procedural generation really comes into play when we're talking about higher level stuff and level design, modes, features, difficulty design, story. Those are all much higher level things. So that's why it's harder to pull off and more interesting to talk about. And you can combine, with roguelikes and games like Spelunky, they randomly generate their levels. And you're like, okay, you're just randomly shuffling around the thingy so that it's never exactly the same every time. So it's got this freshness to it. But you were talking about doing that kind of a thing and mixing it with difficulty design and game conscious difficulty design. So it knows, how skilled you are to a degree. It knows certain attributes and aspects about your character that it can then play off of and have that influence what it produces later on. Because with Spelunky, the seed that's generated doesn't really care who you are, and it's generated assuming you're going to start off with the same blank slate and eventually get all the key items to reach the end of the game, and then it just randomizes a few other factors and items and opportunities. But what you're talking about is something a little more sophisticated. It's talking about higher level design, which includes the generation of
Locks and keys.
Locks, keys, puzzles. It includes the generation of developmental content and tutorialized content that can develop an idea, bring it up, reiterate it, and to various degrees of mandatory player interactions. It can make something more of a subtle hint, a nudge, a gate, or whatever. So that's all more sophisticated kind of level design. And procedural generation mainly means, can we make a system shuffle around the elements that are involved here and still maintain some kind of high-level functional goal? So yeah, like super interesting, just like you said.
Yeah, and I think that it's not out of reach either. Like, some people would say, well, you can't make a computer generate good levels, but you could definitely make a computer generate much better levels than you typically see in a roguelike. Mm-hmm. So if you think about it, the way that the player is kind of asked to interpret the levels in a roguelike is that they don't really mean much. Like, they don't have a lot of significance. They're usually very plain. They're usually like a series of rooms chained together with some side areas, and they don't really have any coherency to them. It's just a bunch of rooms with enemies in them, and the enemies have no, like, there are no implications of the level design that echo forward in the game, really. It's usually a situation where, well, you got some enemies to fight in rooms, and the point of having the enemies there is not to, like, set up for harder enemies later. It's actually just to provide you experience so your character can grow, and provide something to make it more difficult for you to get through an area so it isn't trivially easy and boring. It's like, but achieving very, very simple and basic game design aims in a very stripped down and barely effective way that we just have played so much at this point over the last 30 years that many gamers are like, that's fine. Like, I understand what's going to happen here. It's cool if it doesn't have to be the Water Temple. It can be, something really simple. And if there are puzzles or traps or locks and keys and things, they're going to be really simple, straightforward things that I don't have to think much about. And it's like, almost because the computer is designing it, it has to be simple and straightforward. But it really doesn't. Like, if you can design a system, if you can really think about consciously how to structure a game so that the level design echoes forward and sets things up and presents locks and then gives you keys later, or gives you keys earlier and gives you locks later, or like gives you choices of different paths that interact with one another in different ways, instead of it just being like, well, you can go left or right, but they both end up at the stairs going down to the next floor of the dungeon because that's the framing the game uses. If instead it's like, yeah, you can go down into, the orc mines, but if you go down into the orc mines, not only are you going to come out at a lower level of the main dungeon and skip a whole bunch of stuff, but also there aren't going to be orcs in the rest of the dungeon, and that throws off the balance of some other parts of the game that, like maybe you have to have... The thing is that often the floors in roguelike dungeon design have no interaction with one another whatsoever. Like, every floor is totally independent, and the only things that carry over are the suspended elements that are on your character, so like your stats and your items and your status effects and stuff like that. But what if the monsters in the dungeon, like, have some basic kind of concept of living in the dungeon, and if you do things, you throw off their biological rhythms and stuff, and you cause them to come into conflict with one another, and that changes what rewards are available later. And you can manipulate it so you can become friends with the orcs and not friends with the... But then again, like, you have to think of it as an experience that the procedural generation algorithms generate as the player plays the game. Not as, like, you generate the game and then the player plays through it, but instead as, like, the player plays through one unit of playing at a time, like one floor of the dungeon or one level in the game. And then what they do in that level can feed into all the rest of the levels in a way that you can actually change by having the algorithm take a look. Like, hey, can they breathe underwater now? If they can, I can add some different challenges that are really interesting that are related to the other things they did. Like, they befriended the elves and they can breathe underwater. So, like, maybe the next level will be like a half submerged, like, elf city that's being attacked by orcs. Blah, blah, blah. Like, you could take all those elements and shuffle them around and make a whole lot of interesting set piece, almost like set piece scenarios. But they're procedurally generated instead of just being kind of rote things that you're cycling through.
There's a few things to point out with an idea like that. One, all procedural generation is set to a certain scope. And I think that scope is something that's always lower than what the designers are capable of if they design it by hand, right?
Right.
So their understanding of the level, the dynamics, the rippling forwardness of their emergent decisions, the kind of systems they have in place, the mechanics, the enemy elements, everything. You design at a much simpler scale, and you try to shuffle around those elements that you think will work well together or not break when you shuffle them around. And that's essentially, you could say there's less potential there, a greater potential for just overall variation, but less potential for the kind of tight, polished, or nuanced, or deep kind of gameplay that you could really set up if you did everything by hand. So that's interesting. I think the reason why we see a lot of procedural generation currently is because, like you said, they are not only designing their games around RPGs, which are really simple gameplay systems because their interactions are generally very simple and not very dynamic and turn-based and numerical. So it's a much simpler sort of system to come to terms with. But even games like Spelunky, it's like the only platformer roguelike that was successful, and Derek, you did a really good job with that one. But even games like Downwell, I don't even consider Downwell to be a roguelike because it's just randomly shuffling platforms and where the shops are, but it's not that randomness and that variation is not sophisticated enough to really be sort of making anything that I consider to be complex level design that would really require a sophisticated procedural generation system. So I really feel like Downwell is more like Tetris, where like, okay, I got an L piece. Okay, I got a square. Like, okay, as I keep dropping, I'm just going to get another sort of piece and everything's going to work out nicely.
Right,
So
and the pieces are kind of... and the pieces are indistinct is a key part of that, right? Because it's like the piece, you can see the piece and you're like, oh, this is how I use this piece. Okay, now I'll get through it. It's not like you have to think on your toes now because, you know, you got an X-shaped piece in Tetris, and it's like, what the hell's an X-shaped piece? I've never seen that before. Or like the shape of the well changes in Tetris all of a sudden after you played for 100 hours, and you're like, crap, what do I do now? But it's like very tightly prescribed.
The distinctness of the pieces that get shuffled around for a procedurally generated game is equivalent to the amount of high-level complexity that the procedural generation is modeling, right? Spelunky is modeling a 3-tiered platforming level with traps and always a way to get to the goal without using bombs and ropes on every level, pretty much. So that is more sophisticated than just like there are blocks in your way as you travel downward. So because of that extra level of sophistication and the fact that Spelunky likes to drop in much more complex set pieces as large elements, whether it's a snake pit, whether it's a piranha pit, whether it's the City of Gold, or not City, but Black Market, like the entrance to the Black Market, or any of those other alien ship, any of those other things, like they drop those in as larger chunks to shuffle around, and that also adds a little bit more distinct variety and stability to what would otherwise be a more homogenized set of random variables.
Yeah, right. Like just pieces moved around, and you know what the pieces are because you see them in one playthrough.
Yeah, I guess what I'm trying to say is pieces can only be so interesting. You have to build
Yep.
ideas out of them, and that's what level
Right.
design really is. And modeling that is hard because the more complex ideas you try to build, you need more and more control. And typically, procedurally generation is a step down in terms of your control and your ability to
Right.
generate that.
But then the thing is that people don't have. I think that in order to, well, I know that in order to procedurally generate something, you have to make an algorithm to do it, which means you have to understand it. And often people design very intuitively when they do level design, and having a conscious understanding of level design is not something you will find in many people who do level design.
Yeah.
So that's the first step. But then you think about like how many fantastic level designers are also good programmers and can think algorithmically and put and like make a regularized process that can be executed by a machine out of what is a creative endeavor that is making levels. Like the number of people who have all the skills that are required to do that effectively is very small.
Yeah. There's something you brought up in kind of what you just said now that kind of brings me to the next major point I wanted to bring up. What is really the point of doing procedural generation, right? We kind of hinted on the fact that there's only so much you can do with shuffling around bits. You got to build more complex, higher level ideas. And then when you do that, it's going to lack a level of polish, a level of fine-tuningness, because your algorithm can only be so precise. It can't be better than you sitting and staring at a static thing and tuning it, because it's got to generate those on the fly. And that's just the give and take that should be pretty
Actually,
obvious.
it can be better than you, I think, if you make it sufficiently adaptive. Because think about it, like you don't have to even generate the entire level when you enter the floor in a roguelike. You could generate the next room on the fly to suit the needs of the previous rooms. Like you can break it down to a very fine level and examine what the player is doing and be aware of it. And it's just a matter of how deeply you can go into knowing your system and assembling it away. Like so you know what the interactions can be, and then you can mix in elements like different criteria for generating rooms and stuff that will make it interesting and not broken. And it's like the thing is that when you're designing it statically, the player can do all kinds of things to break it, but if you do it dynamically and you suit the player more, you actually give yourself a lot more leeway in level design, because you can make sure it's not broken by incrementally generating it and like if the player does something, you can just generate the next room to be different so he doesn't end up breaking the difficulty progression. Like if he sequence breaks something effectively, even though it's like impossible in a roguelike because of reasons. Because right, it's impossible in a roguelike because there is no real sequence. Like you can't hack through the floor in Rogue or something silly like that. You have to get to the stairs and go down. Like they're built in a very constrained way, so you can't sequence break them. But like let's say you do have this higher level design thing, and the player sequence breaks by going through a door. If you didn't even generate the room on the other side of that door until the player got through it, you can avoid the game breaking down at that point. Like you could just generate the room to be different.
We're talking about two different things, I think. I'm just in general talking about you can't build, or in the same way that your procedural generation algorithm is going to be less sophisticated than your abilities overall, and because you're generating it from that sort of simpler understanding of your own level design, then this procedural code cannot generate a level that's more sophisticated than what you could do if you sat down with a more static level and played it in a bunch of different ways and then observed it emergently and then tweaked it very specifically for that one very specific effect.
Yeah, but that's true to some extent. But you got also I'm saying that you should take into account the constraint of making static levels by hand, which is that you're making them once, and you're making them with a certain thing and with a certain difficulty level and stuff in mind that is totally inflexible to the player.
Yes, I mean
beyond some very tightly articulated constraints.
So you're saying that the primary benefit of doing anything procedurally generated is its ability to be flexible, and then maybe its ability to be variable and unpredictable.
Well, I think that I would say that like in the procedural generation that I would like to see people work on, that would be the case. But I think in current day procedural generation, that's not the case. I think right now, procedural generation is just to provide like a kind of varying background against which you can explore progression systems,
Mm-hmm.
basically, or like test isolated skills, like in the case of Rogue Legacy.
Mm-hmm. I think so. A lot of the ideas that you said before about having the system be able to see what you do that's emergent, and then as additional content, additional levels are generated, procedurally generate those levels with more sophisticated level design goals around data that it gathers from how you've actually played up until that point. I think that idea is kind of interesting. And one of the things I wanted to focus on was the difference between creating just really dynamic gameplay in general like that, or what kind of systems would benefit most from procedurally generated content that looks at your all your stats, all your items, and all of how you've played up until that point. And I think you kind of hinted at it, and you were saying, oh, if you have, you don't really need to do that much looking at how the player plays for a much more action-oriented game, I think, like Spelunky. Because guess how you played? You avoided stuff by jumping and moving. Maybe you could look at how you avoid traps and try to do something that would make the methods you've used before not so useful or tricky or whatever. Maybe you could do that.
But it's all tiles in Spelunky. That's the thing. Like, we don't... I think that we have to probably confine our discussion here to, turn-based dungeon crawling roguelikes, just so that we don't get caught up in the details of like procedural generation for an action game versus procedural generation for basically a strategy game. Because I think that in a situation like Spelunky, where there's like real-time stuff and timing windows, and there's a lot of things that you need to work on with the action-oriented part of it, when you're doing procedural generation, like maybe the tile-based approach is more necessary, or it's harder to get away without doing it. Whereas in a dungeon crawler that's turn-based, the player has time to react to everything, so you don't have to worry about timing windows as much. You could do a lot more mathy kind of figure out how many hits it takes to kill things, and then scale enemies accordingly and stuff like that. So I think that maybe we should confine our discussion a little bit here. Like, I don't know. Do you think that what I'm saying is that distinction is not actually important, and that you should be able to do it to both?
I mean, I don't think it's important. The games may be aiming for different kinds of play experiences, but they're all set to, common general skills that people apply. And what we're talking about is, anyway, the conversation was moving to what kind of systems would benefit most from having the system look at it in a detailed way and then generate content beyond for it. And if you're not doing that many customizable things in a system like Spelunky, because you're mainly just moving, jumping, and moving around, then maybe that doesn't give the system enough specific data to work off of that you can build an algorithm around. But for a game that has a much bigger design space, like RPGs tend to do, like stats tend to bring to the table, and how much harder it is to get sort of clear, discrete, and meaningful challenges that your particular stat build is designed around, then maybe this is a place where procedurally generated content can step in. Because one of the common sort of pitfalls for RPGs, systems with heavy stat building and EXP and all that, is you can have such a fine grain to your stats and not have a really good way to figure out what that fine grain means. Like, what does one extra point mean for your attack? When will it actually start affecting the actions that happen in the game in a way that you can observe? Can you beat the enemies in one less hit? Do you dodge 50% more, 20% more? Like, when do those numbers matter? And perhaps a procedural generation system can, in a very similar way to auto leveling does, build and tweak its variables, including its level design, to make whatever stats that you have currently the right stats to make the next level more interesting.
But then it gets really weird, because you're in the situation where why even bother having stat progression? Because it doesn't mean anything to the game more broadly. It just kind of, your plus or minus relatively speaking, to the enemies around you, and that's all that really matters in many games.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're procedurally generating things to be close to you in terms of difficulty, then you're just kind of failing. I was aiming for a different thing that was on a higher level than even like making the stats line up. It was more about
yours sounded more like set piece and scenario and conceptual, like rippling forward of consequences of actions.
So like exploring the discrete elements that are in level design and adding those into the procedural generation algorithms of roguelikes, as opposed to just kind of doing difficulty variation based on procedural generation that's based on the player character's stats.
Yeah, roguelikes don't tend to have a lot of set pieces, if you will. They have level floor themes. They have bosses at times that are come on a semi-regular schedule, but they don't really have like the slip and slide floor. This whole floor is about slip and slide. You're like, woo, stuff like that. And then have like a neat thing for you to interact with in order to get through it. So what you're saying, kind of like what we were kind of saying with Spelunky, in order to inject some more complex themes and set pieces into the level, Derek Yu, I think he just literally had to throw in, he literally had to build his algorithm to throw in these chunks to where it's like, oh, it's a huge sort of pre-made chunk that's already well tuned and everything, and then you don't know where that chunk is going to be in relation to the dimensions of the room, and you don't know when that chunk is going to be inserted, but at least you're going to get yourself a nice well tuned chunk of gameplay. And what you're saying is, how do we add more well tuned, discrete, distinct, and conceptual higher level stuff to procedurally generated algorithms?
Stuff that's not just making nice tiles and gluing them together.
Yeah,
stuff
or
stuff
making
that
it
is
look nice, organic, making it not look like it was stitched.
Because with a lot of Spelunky stuff, I get a very stitched feeling to it, because it's like there are 25 room types per I don't know if you want to call them room types, but tiles per. I don't even know what the numbers are, because I never played the game enough to catalog them all, but I definitely see repeating patterns in the level design that are like on a scale that's too large to have been done by randomness alone. So I know that there's definitely tile combining going on there. That's also what Diablo 3 does with its dungeon design. It just takes like tiles that are pretty big and glues them together with the entry points lining up with the entry points of the other tiles. And that's whatever. That's fine, I guess. Like that's some procedural but then again, the terrain in Diablo 3 doesn't matter much. Usually it's like just flat with no variation, whereas in Spelunky there's like gold on the floor, and the enemies can be in different places, and there's ladders in different places, and that kind of stuff. And so yeah, it's about taking the tile concept, and instead of just having a bunch of tiles that you glue together, having the concepts that you glue together, and the concepts themselves generate different scenarios based on how they come together. And it's not just putting concept A next to concept B. It's actually like intermingling them.
I think this is the ultimate problem I think that you will run into when talking about procedural generation and how to make it more and more sophisticated, more complex with these higher level ideas and concepts. And this is kind of what brought me to thinking about the original idea that inspired this conversation. Like, instead of trying to create a system that simulates a story and tries to simulate dialogue and simulate what characters could or would do in all these various cases and try to make the responses believable or lifelike or whatever, like, what if we let go of doing that kind of detailed algorithm work and have the characters be fixed? So like the story is the same, the plot's the same, the events that happen are the same. They go to the same places and about the same times, and the same characters will be there. So then my thinking was, well, just the content of the story, the characters, the setting, those basic things like that, the actions they do, that's low level story design, right? Like, anyone can design a character, anyone can pick a place for it to go. Like, that doesn't have too many pros or cons, because that's just setting the foundation of the story you're building. But the true story design comes from how the story is told, and just from the sequence of events that you dole out, just from how much you focus on one thing versus the other, the amount of this you put in dialogue, the amount you zoom in on faces, the amount you show the environment around them instead of the main actors. Like that all has an effect on how the story is actually told and what kind of tones and feelings that you generate. So I was like, if it's too hard to create a simulation that's accurate, then why don't we use procedural generation to address the telling of the story, or a sort of a different aspect of high-level execution that isn't the ideas everyone else is running towards. And if you mess with the telling, you have a whole new sort of realm of knobs, switches, and verbs to mess around with. And perhaps you could take the same story and turn it into a comedy just by focusing on different things. The system could do that for you if it's procedurally generated. Perhaps you could take the same basic story and turn it into somewhat of a tragedy just by revealing like one slight detail or lingering on something a little bit more. Who knows? But that's the general idea.
And the issue that I have and had when we originally discussed this with that is that you're putting the computer in charge of something that is, or in the form of having algorithms do it, you're putting the computer in charge of something that humans do more intuitively even than systems design, which is evoking emotions using sights and sounds, and that computers will have a lot of trouble doing that in a credible fashion. And people really are very good at telling when that's wrong, whereas people are a bit worse at telling when game balance systems and rules are wrong.
Anything with numbers.
People like statistical stuff, people are really have a hard time with. But if you're framing shots wrong and you're not showing the right emotional cues, people know that this is not working for them emotionally, and they know it's not reverberating with them, and there's no amount of analysis that they have to do to arrive at that conclusion. Like, it's immediate. And I think it would be a lot easier for the player to lose his sense of suspension of disbelief in a scenario where a computer is trying to configure the camera shots. Because they'd just be like, well, this didn't work. Like, I know it didn't work. I don't know why, but it sucks. Like, I didn't feel anything. Whereas, like, if you were doing it, you just know. Because you're biological.
I mean, I don't think it's any different when you're dealing with.
I think. Do you think people have systematized how? Like, could you sit down and write out a generic set of instructions for how to film a scene in which you wanted to achieve a certain emotional goal?
Well, yeah. If your scene is made up of characters talking to each other, then just showing their faces would be a way of directly having them sort of emote to the viewer, and then doing sort of a wide shot where they're both in frame is just a way to create more distance, and then going even further back to where their audio is suppressed and there's more sort of things in this scene is a way to create even more distance. And you can just play with an axis as simple as camera zoom level to create different levels of distance, and depending on the emotions that are in the scene based on the dialogue, that would create a different kind of effect. The idea has a lot of range of being both simple and easily manipulated, or you can go and shoot for the moon and try to make like a full movie director inside of your algorithm. But I think there's a lot of range there, and just like with anything else, shooting for simpler ideas will have a lot more success.
Yeah, I would certainly be interested in seeing it. It triggers some of my engineer alarm bells, because I think immediately of how, like, if you're gonna have a computer do something, like if you're gonna sit there when you're making a game and allocate the tasks of game design and say a computer should do this task and I should do that task, I would think the more traditionally arty tasks would go to the human, and the more traditionally engineering and sciencey tasks would go to the computer. And you're basically saying, hey, why don't we just give an arty task to the computer? And I think that we can. Like, we could definitely do it. And I think with enough study and practice, we could make it work pretty damn well. But it sounds wrong to me, because it sounds like it's approaching a problem that is very, very easy, even easier than the stuff we have now to get wrong, instead of other problems that we've already made progress on that we're kind of close to not getting totally wrong.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, my background being English and creative writing, to me it just seems so normal, because I kind of live in the world of breaking stuff like this down and thinking about how they interrelate. So maybe it's just more of where you're comfortable with, what you think is more or less difficult.
And of course, programmers are the people doing the procedural generation stuff. So it's typically the person who doesn't spend time like analyzing camera shots in detail who is writing the procedural generation code. So they're not going to write it to procedurally generate the cinematic. They're going to write it to procedurally generate a level.
Yeah. It's hard to find somebody who can do both, or people that can walk both sides.
Yeah, and it's not just like, oh, right brain, left brain. Some people are creative and some people are robots. No, it's actually about time, because in order to really master these things, it takes like thousands of hours of watching critically what's going on around you in specific fields, engaging with specific like expert level discussions, and like confronting the masters of the work, like by watching their films, by listening to interviews. It takes so much time to like even become a competent programmer. It takes a very long time to become a competent creative writer. It takes a long time, and like those things just come into conflict with one another at the very basic level of time allocation. Like maybe you just can't be both of those things at once without being a super genius.
Yeah,
and maybe only 15 people in the United States at a given time can do that, and I'm not one of them.
Yeah.
So it's difficult because you spend your time a lot more with the story side of things, and I spend my time a lot less with the story side of things. So to me, it seems opaque. To you, it's pretty clear. Where with systems things, sometimes to me it feels like it's pretty clear to me, but it would be opaque to you. Maybe, I don't know. Like you have less of a mathematical background, but the thing is that we don't even have a really good way of translating games into math. So I don't have a good mathematical background either, but I spend enough time programming that the logical reasoning parts of my brain are more developed than most people. So basically different areas of expertise. Takes a lot of time to develop them, and you can't do them all really unless you're special, and we're only so special.
You can only have so many special points, and the world is not generated around you.
Yeah, it's like what Richard and I were discussing. We were saying earlier that like we aren't we play almost none of the same games, but we can still talk about game design and have a very educated, interesting discussion about it, that we both learn stuff because we are both good enough at communicating that we can bridge the gaps. And that's like really important, I think, with game design in general. It's an area where opinion reigns so freely, and people feel free to say a lot of crazy things and a lot of non-crazy things and a lot of things. And like weeding through it's really hard, and especially when you don't have a common basis. And it's something special that I found with Richard, where we can communicate about game design, and it's not like a freaking mess. Like we can actually meet each other halfway, even though we don't share a lot of experiences, which is like amazing. And I have not had that experience with a lot of other people. So it just goes to show, like, don't get downtrodden when you're talking to people about game design and it feels like you can't agree on anything, because there are people out there who will be able to see eye to eye with you, and you'll be able to have good conversations with. You just got to keep working and looking.
You know what? When you were talking earlier about procedural generation, Proc Gen, I really didn't want to say Proc Gen, but I'm starting to see the benefits of shortening it. With Proc Gen, you remember RO, right?
Ragnarok Online?
RO.
RO?
Keith Bergen's game?
Keith Bergen's game. I thought you were saying RO, like an abbreviation. Wow. That's funny.
Yeah, that game, inspired by roguelike elements, but really trying to be a strategy game instead of a roguelike. So they ditched pretty much all the elements that make roguelikes difficult to be strategy games, and they got rid of stats. They got rid of a lot of suspended elements with character progression. They got rid of so many of those things and just focused on the dynamics of hitting enemies in a space and then trying to get to a goal, right? So even though the levels are randomly generated, we'll say, to some degree procedurally generated, it's got the same kind of feel to it. It's interesting because they won't give you enemies that you can't defeat, just like we were saying before about auto-leveling enemies so that they're more or less around your level. They don't give you enemies that you can't beat with the current spells that they randomly give you, so you always have what you need to take on the challenge, and that's kind of interesting in some ways and not interesting in others. So it's not interesting because there's not a lot of room in that game to come up to something you can't do and then come back to it later, or have it be sort of a roadblock or some kind of hindrance to you. So like everything you see, you're like, I know I can beat it. And on the other hand, for a strategy game, knowing that there's something there that you can look to, some nuance, some kind of combination that you can overcome it, is why it probably works well as a strategy game and not as an adventure game, an RPG, or anything like that. So that's an interesting case to study when you're talking about how do we generate things around a sort of a variable player state, and in this case you start off with like a semi-random character roll because they have randomized spells.
Well, the spells are designed, but they're selected at random.
Yeah, like
so it's like so the spells, each individual spell is always the same and has the same parameters and stuff. Mm-hmm. But you get a different spell when you start the game, and then as you go through, you get random spells.
Should have said random build or whatever.
Randomly
random
selected,
set.
I guess that's it.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's one of the elements of what I was talking about. But the other one is like the thing is, Oro is still a game where the floors of there's like no suspended elements and there's no suspended level design elements either. Mm. So it's not like you're going to go back to level 2 after you complete level 3 because now you can get through the ice wall by melting it and then you can explore some other thing. It's like there's no layeredness to its level design.
It's like an arcade. You just keep pressing forward, kind of like Pac-Man, where you're playing the same level over and over again, but every time you play it, it's a little different in how you get to the goal, but it's still the same goal every time.
Yeah, right. I was like, what I was hoping to get at was that I think that we can make procedurally generated layered level design to some extent and significantly improve the quality of roguelike floors, levels, whatever you want to call them.
Yeah, if you completely break the mold of just going deeper, 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 and actually do what you're talking about, have elements that matter across floors and even the ability to travel back to other floors and put together sort of larger cross-floor challenges, puzzles, secrets, whatever. That's really exciting. That will turn the world, instead of like a little arcade sprints to the end of the floor to get down the stairs or whatever, or climb the ladder, it would be more like a world, and it would have that extra layer of consideration, and that's precisely, I think that's what you're saying.
Yep, and I think that we haven't seen any games today yet.
Nope. There's so many things I want to say, but we can cut this off for like right around here, and I know you don't have too much time left.